The following story occurred in the summer of 2005. I lived in Athens, Georgia, and attended the University of Georgia. At the time, my girlfriend, now wife, lived in Atlanta, which was about a 65-mile drive from my hometown. The highway which takes you to Atlanta from Athens is a 2-lane highway called 316. This is important information for the story. It was a Sunday evening. I had spent the weekend in Atlanta and was now driving back to Athens. In the summer, there are very few cars on the road on Sunday evenings, as many of the students go home for the summer. I was driving a black BMW SUV and was cruising along listening to music. I saw no cars for miles and was approaching a traffic light along 316. The traffic light was red, and I came to a stop alongside an old Mustang. It looked like one of those models from the 1980s, was black in color with a rag top. The windows of the vehicle were tinted. I didn't really give the car a second thought. I just sat there and waited for the light to turn green. When it did, the Mustang suddenly sped off with a squeal of the tires. As if the driver floored it from the idle position, the car sped off far in front of me. I was a bit surprised, but I just thought, another redneck, who cares? The Mustang was soon out of sight and out of mind. I continue driving along, and I'm back in chill mode again, when suddenly, a car with its high beams on appears directly behind me. What the hell? I quickly realized it was the same Mustang from before. They had been waiting alongside the highway for me. I nervously looked down to make sure my phone was still charging, just in case I needed it. It was. The Mustang switches lanes and flies up beside me, keeping pace for a few seconds. The driver then swerves in front of me, then suddenly brakes, bringing the car to a halt. I swerve into the other lane. The Mustang quickly speeds up beside me and starts swerving, trying to knock me off the road. They charge ahead again and try the same braking maneuver once more. At this point, I am freaking out. Now, I'm a 6'3", 220-pound male who works out all the time. I don't easily get scared. But in this situation, size did not matter. I note the license plate on the car and grab my phone. But as I do, the Mustang is suddenly beside me again and begins swerving. I jerk my wheel to the side, and my phone goes flying out of my hands into the passenger side door well. Shit! The Mustang is then behind me, flashing its brights, right on my bumper, speeding up, slowing down, blaring its horn, swerving from side to side. They suddenly take off and are soon out of sight. I take the opportunity to collect myself and drive the remaining 10 minutes to the turnoff road to Athens. I make a quick decision to drive to the police station to file a report. I had the license plate number memorized and had been reciting it over and over again. As I turn off the road to Athens, bright headlights fill my rearview mirror again, and the Mustang is behind me. It speeds past me, turns down another road, and is gone. I arrived at the police station and give them the license plate number. It's a fairly small station, and I think there was only one officer working. He tells me that it's probably somebody mistaking me for somebody else. He runs the plate number and tells me the owner of those tags is deceased. Holy shit. Now I'm really freaked out. I finish filing the report and head home. The story doesn't end there. Later that night, when I was on the phone with my girlfriend, someone outside beats loudly on my garage door several times. Before I could get out to see who it was, I heard a squeal of tires. I never saw a car, but I called the cops immediately, and there has never been any kind of follow-up. I didn't sleep for several nights after that. A few years ago, I worked at a Jewish summer camp in northern Georgia. As many of you might know, Georgia is a fairly conservative state, as well as being predominantly Christian. There are small Jewish communities in a few summer camps. I would say this camp was more culturally Jewish than it was religious. Rather, it was a place for kids who were often in the minority to come and meet other kids like them. The staff was from all over. We had many Australians, a lot of Brits, a few Israelis, and some other people from various areas of the United States. Each night at around 10 p.m., most of the staff was able to go out on the town for a couple of hours. Of course, some of us remained behind to watch the cabins, and we would rotate. On this particular night, a group of about 5 of us decided to go to a local bar and grab a few beers. It had been a hot day, and it was a humid night, so we decided to sit outside on the patio. Most of the time, we were extremely well received by the locals. We brought in lots of revenue for the town during the summer. We bought supplies at the local stores and would rent canoes for the campers, and occasionally went out for dinner after a long hike on the Appalachian Trail. It was midsummer, so we had already been out to the bars in this area many times before. The 5 of us sat around a table, drinking and discussing the events of the day, as fellow employees typically would do after work. About 30 minutes into this, a guy who I would say was in his 20s came up to our table. I distinctly remember a jagged scar on his cheek, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After introducing himself, he told us that he was having a party at his place. He said that everyone was welcomed. Whites, blacks, gay, straight, it didn't matter. I found it kinda odd he felt the need to specify. But our group was a few beers in at this point, and were feeling pretty loose. He went on for a bit longer, and nothing really seemed off. We told him we worked at a summer camp in the area, and that we couldn't stay out too late, and we would have to head back soon. About an hour later, we were ready to leave. Our group exited the bar into the parking lot. As we approached the car, we saw that same guy come out of the shadows. He was with someone with a shaved head. They had a look of pure hatred in their eyes. He pounded his fist into his hand, then took off his shirt, revealing a crude Nazi tattoo on his chest. My stomach dropped. One of the bigger guys in our group, Kevin, immediately reacted by pulling a knife out of his back pocket. At summer camp, most of the staff carried knives. We usually used them for building fires. We asked them what they wanted, and they began shouting anti-Semitic remarks at us, and that they were going to beat us down. Kevin began walking toward the 2 men, but we restrained him. Suddenly, more men began walking into the parking lot. What happened next is a bit of a blur. I remember us being almost surrounded, pulling Kevin into the car, and rocks bouncing off the windows as we sped off. My heart was practically beating out of my chest. We never went back to that bar. On the bright side, when we shared this story at the only other bar in town, the bartender lined up 6 shots for us and said that we would always be welcomed at his place and this town. This happened a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent. I was a mother in my early 30s who had just driven my kids to the pediatrician. The doctor's office was in Macon, Georgia, and was about an hour away, and I was taking the 2 youngest of my 3 to our scheduled appointment. At the time, they were ages 1 and 3. Because we lived so far away, their office gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and I was grateful for that. The doctor had just built a new facility off the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction. But it was a very nice building compared to his old spot by the hospital. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot. My black Jeep Cherokee was only one of 4 or 5 cars in the lot when we arrived. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and we were finally heading back outside. By this point, my Jeep was the only one left in the parking lot. I loaded up the children into the car seats for the long trip home, but as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car, for some reason, would not start. Whenever I turned the key, there was just this odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the front door until someone allowed us back inside, and I asked to use their phone so I could call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book. Remember those? The attendant I spoke to on the phone said that he would be there, but that it might take a while. I told him my location and left to get back into the Jeep, rolled down the windows, and loaded the kids back into their car seats once more, and we waited. We watched as all the lights were turned out in the building, and everyone left, their cars departing one by one from the employee parking lot behind the building, leaving us completely alone. I spent a lot of the time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks and a bottle, and making sure they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that he was probably going to be a while, I was surprised when I saw a truck pull into the empty lot, and pretty soon, a man stepped out. He smiled and nodded, and said that he was going to raise the hood. He was a middle-aged man, a bit scruffy looking. But honestly, most of the folks I know who work on cars often look like that, especially at the end of the day. I was just grateful that he was here working on the car. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking all the connections. I wanted him to just grab his jumper cables or something, but he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what was wrong. He responded, "Oh, it's just a loose wire. It's not the battery," and continued with whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through that long horizontal slit between the windshield and the raised hood. More than once, he said that it was just a loose wire. "Can you just come up here real quick and I'll show you which one, so that this never happens again?" I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that there was no reason to show me anything, as I know nothing about cars. I politely thanked him and stayed in the driver's seat. Again, just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition. Surely that was coming any moment. At one point, I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting with me as he spoke. I was trying above all to be polite and kind, as I thought he was trying to help us, but we were hot and tired and miserable. And truthfully, I was distracted with the kids. He was beginning to sound a bit frustrated with me because I wouldn't get out and look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad to where he left us all alone with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into the parking lot, and as it did, the man suddenly slammed the hood shut, ran to his truck, and quickly drove away without even saying goodbye. I was both confused and a bit anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was arriving. I remember feeling a bit apprehensive that he had left me there all alone with my two little ones, completely defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay or speak to whoever just pulled up? That certainly seemed like the gentlemanly thing to do. I looked around and was very aware. Once again, there were no visible cars on the road, no homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set. It was near dark. As this new, unmarked pickup truck pulled up next to me, I got out of the car once again. This time I was a bit more apprehensive, Upon exiting, the man immediately introduced himself. His name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He actually called me by name and apologized for being so late. He then asked me who that man was who had just left. Relieved and unfazed, I just smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I don't know. I thought all this time he was you." We both laughed, and he grabbed his jumper cables, walked in front of my car, raised the hood, and began to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with a bit of luck, the air conditioner will be blowing at full blast here shortly. While listening for the man to tell me to try the engine, I had my back completely turned as I was checking on the children. The man surprised me by suddenly coming near the driver's side door. He then said in a very concerned voice, Ma'am? Is this yours?" When I looked in his hands, he was holding a very long, dagger-like object that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered in rust. On one end, it had these tiny circular finger holes, as if it was a mix between a sword and a pair of scissors. I remember being amazed, but not frightened. I asked where he had found it. "It was under your hood." I just said, matter-of-factly, that I had never seen it before. He continued to stand there and stare at it. He looked oddly pale, as if he couldn't find the words to say, and just continued staring at the unusual object. Honestly, all I cared about was getting the Jeep started. Nothing else mattered. He didn't say anything else. He just set it on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled for me to start the Jeep. When the engine eventually started back up, my 3-year-old cheered. I quickly turned the AC on at full blast, rolled up all the windows, and aimed the air vents toward the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay. I got out of the car, took a few steps toward him so that he could tell me what I owed. He came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, he walked right past me and picked up that strange object again. "Ma'am, I want you to look at these one more time." He held it out for a closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and really looked at it. In his hands, the item still appeared incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet quality, except for the small loopholes at the end. I had never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly, as if desperately trying to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These were not hidden in your engine, ma'am. They were sitting right on top, meaning that they had just been placed there." I shook my head and smiled. "They're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but do you see how sharp it is? This blade looks like it has just been sharpened." When I looked down, I could see that he was right. The long dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip where the rust had been removed was shining. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, and told me that I probably needed to contact the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted him to place the dagger. I didn't even want to take it with me, but I opened the back window so he could place it in the trunk. We left the lot together, him turning one way and me towards the other, heading down the small winding highway that led home, which was still an hour away. The moment that we arrived home and the children were safely inside, I did in fact contact the police. Although the officer on the phone listened politely, he declined when I offered to bring in the scissor-like sword. I was told that they sounded like they were a pair of specialized surgical shears based on my description and measurements over the phone, which I found to be quite disturbing. I remember wondering how he would even know that. I tried my best not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping that someday they might be able to lift off prints or test it for DNA. But the story seemed to bore the officer. He didn't really seem interested at all. His attitude insinuated that there was no longer an emergency, and this phone call was no longer important. At the very end of the call, as if to spice things up a bit, he did suggest that it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to hold on to the shears for a couple of days, just in case someone from his office got back to me later. I wrapped it carefully in newspaper and placed it in a brick storage unit behind our house. There they remained for several years, untouched, until we finally moved out. Not wanting to bring them across several states, I reluctantly threw them in the garbage. If you look through the old news reports, several women had gone missing all over the state of Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if that service attendant hadn't arrived when he did. If my children would still have a mother, if I would still have my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know. But I learned something very important about myself that day. I had always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people, and staying safe. But because I was so exhausted and tired and hot and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a while and wasn't working at that time. Many of my friends and family believe that our car trouble and my lack of awareness that day could have easily cost us our lives.